I was drawing tiny daisies on my 8-year-old's fingernails with a felt-tip pen when my phone lit up with 41 messages. My daughter held her hand still and whispered that ours was the best party in the whole world, even though it was just the two of us and a grocery store cake. Then I read the pinned message from my mom, sitting on top of the family group chat like a headstone. She had invited the whole family to her 60th birthday. Everyone but me and Daisy. I didn't text back, but 3 weeks later, at that party, my mother would open her mouth to say something to me, and nothing would come out. Here's what none of them knew was already in motion. They called me the lowly one. They just forgot who keeps the books. Where quiet women set loud boundaries and pride meets the truth it's been dodging. I'm Erica, 34, a single mom and the accountant nobody in my family ever thanked. If a family that measured you by your paycheck ever left you off the list, pull up a chair. This one's for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. The message wasn't a slip. My mother, Lorraine Hale, had typed it out slow and proud, the way she did everything meant to wound. She wrote that she wanted her 60th to be surrounded only by the children who had made her proud. Then she named them. My brother, Kyle. My sister, Vanessa. Their spouses, their kids, the neighbors, the pastor. And then, so no one would have to guess, she added the part she'd been waiting years to say out loud. Every one of my children made me proud, she wrote, except Erica. She chose to be a lowly single mom. My sister, Vanessa, was the first to react. A little heart, tapped onto the sentence like a period. Nobody argued. Nobody typed a word in my defense, and I watched the 3 dots appear and disappear from a dozen people who had eaten at my table. I set the phone face down on the couch. Daisy asked if I liked the daisies, and I told her they were the finest nails in the county. I meant it. Arguing with my mother was like auditing a company that had already shredded the receipts. You could be right down to the penny and still walk out with nothing but ink on your hands. So I didn't. I capped the pen. I finished the cake. I let the phone buzz itself quiet against the cushion while my daughter told me a long, serious story about a frog she'd named after her teacher. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen by the ones who never will. I'd stopped waiting a long time ago. What I hadn't stopped doing was paying attention, and attention, it turns out, keeps better records than any group chat. By 6 the next morning, I was unlocking the glass door of Hale Ledger Company, my one-room practice above the hardware store on Main. I made the coffee. I turned on the space heater that had never once heated the space. 3 clients. That was my whole world some weeks. And I knew every dollar that moved through their little businesses like I knew Daisy's cough in the dark. I built this the hard way. I got my CPA license studying at the kitchen table after midnight, a baby monitor hissing beside my textbooks. My ex already halfway out the door. People in my family liked to say I'd chosen the hard road, as if the easy one had ever been offered. What they never mentioned was the spring 4 years back, when Vanessa's little medical billing side business nearly went under. She'd mixed personal and payroll accounts until the whole thing was a knot no one could untie. I untied it. I sat at her dining table for 2 weekends and pulled her out of a hole that would have swallowed her credit for a decade. She thanked me by never mentioning it again. That was the family arithmetic. My help disappeared the second it was given, and my failures got engraved. I didn't mind the quiet anymore. The quiet was where I did my best work. But that morning, wiping the fog off the window, I felt something I couldn't name yet. A small wrong number at the bottom of a column. Grant's name had started showing up in my mother's sentences. And in my experience, when a man who sells you dreams starts handling your mother's money, you don't wait to see the statement. Daisy waited until bath night to ask. She was pruny and warm and building a mountain out of bubbles when she looked up and said it plain. Mom, why aren't we going to Grandma's party? I could have lied. I could have said we were busy, that grown-ups have their reasons, that Grandma loved her very much. Instead, I knelt on the cold tile and told her the true but gentle version, the one that didn't make her carry my mother's cruelty in her small chest. I told her that sometimes people decide there's only room at the table for a certain kind of family, and that we didn't fit their picture. She thought about that the way she thinks about everything, seriously, her chin tucked. Then she asked the question that would follow me all the way to the ballroom. Grandma, are we not real family? I wiped a curl of foam off her cheek. We're the realest thing I've got, I said, and I felt the words land somewhere permanent in both of us. She nodded like a woman closing a case. Then she informed me that we would throw our own party, better than Grandma's, with a lake and a cake, and no mean messages, and that I was invited because I was real family. I said I'd be honored. Later, after she was asleep, I stood in her doorway longer than I needed to. My mother had spent 60 years learning to shut people out. My daughter had spent 8 years deciding who belonged. I knew which one of them I wanted to grow up to be. And I knew, standing there, that whatever came next, the one thing I would not let anyone do again was make that child feel like a guest in her own blood. 2 days later, I drove across town to drop off a casserole dish I'd been meaning to return, and to see the throne room one more time before the coronation. The Hale house sat at the end of Ridgeline Road, white clapboard and a deep front porch. Every board of it raised by my father's own hands. Raymond Hale built that house the year he came home for good, and he built it to last longer than any of us. It was my mother's whole kingdom now. It was where every Thanksgiving happened. Every graduation photo got taken. Every casket got carried down the steps. She met me at the door and didn't invite me in. She was mid-flight about the gala, the ballroom at Lakemont Club, the string quartet, the caterer she'd flown in ideas from. 60 people. A dress the color of champagne. She talked at me the way you talk at a delivery driver, brisk and looking past my shoulder. I handed her the dish. And then, buffing an invisible spot off the doorframe, she said the thing that turned my stomach cold. Grant's handling the finances for all of it now. He's freed up so much. He's very sharp. She said it like a woman describing a new appliance. I asked, careful, how much he'd freed up. She waved me off. Money's not really your area, is it, dear? I let it go. But driving home, I did the math I couldn't help doing. A retired widow, a string quartet, a son-in-law who'd never held $1 he didn't spend twice. The columns weren't adding up, and my mother had just handed the pen to the one man in the family who couldn't count. Grant Dunn had married my sister 11 years ago in a tent that cost more than my first car. He was a contractor, or he called himself one, the kind who shows up to Sunday dinner in a truck with the dealer plate still on and a story about a development that's about to break ground. Lately, the story was Lakemont Ridge, a subdivision he swore would put the town on the map, and he'd been telling it at every table that would seat him. My sister glowed beside him like a woman guarding a house of cards from the wind. Vanessa had always needed the picture to be perfect. The marriage, the kids in matching sweaters, the sense that she'd bet on the right man. I'd stopped believing the picture around the same time I stopped getting invited to be in it. When I ran into them at the pharmacy, Grant clapped my shoulder and told me he'd been streamlining Lorraine's whole financial life, rolling old accounts into smarter positions. I asked lightly if I could take a look at the paperwork sometime. Professional courtesy. His smile didn't move, but his eyes did. "You're not the only one in this family who understands money, Erica," he said. Vanessa laughed too fast and steered him toward the register. I stood in the vitamin aisle and felt the wrong number get bigger. Grant had been telling his big development stories for 11 years, and for 11 years I'd let them roll right past me, because a man's tall tales are his own business, right up until the day he starts funding them with my mother's money. Until that afternoon, he'd never touched $1 of hers, and I'd had no more standing to audit my brother-in-law than to audit a stranger on the street. That had just changed. Men like Grant don't streamline. They siphon, slow, with a smile, and they always pick the person least likely to check the statements. My mother trusted him because he flattered her. My sister trusted him because she had to. And I was the only one holding a calculator. Standing outside a door they'd already locked, listening to something being quietly taken apart on the other side. I didn't let it sit. That week I called my mother, not to fight, just to plant one sentence where she couldn't unhear it. "Mom, don't co-sign anything for Grant until I read it first, please. That's all I ask." There was a pause on the line, and in the pause I heard a page turn, some crossword she was doing to prove I wasn't important. "It's already done," she said, "and it's not your business." I asked her, as level as I could, what was already done. She told me Grant had consolidated things weeks ago, that she'd signed some papers at his kitchen table, that a line of credit had been opened against the house to put her money to work. A HELOC. On my father's house. I felt the floor tilt. I told her she needed to close it, today, that we could sit down together and I'd help her understand every page. She said the money was already moving into Grant's project, that it was too late to be a nervous old woman about it, and that Raymond would be ashamed of how little faith I had in family. Then she hung up. I sat with the phone warm against my ear and a truth I hated settling in. I couldn't close a thing. It wasn't my account. It wasn't my signature. She was a competent adult, and I had no legal standing to freeze $1 of it, and by the time I could get standing, the money would be gone. She'd been warned. She'd chosen the crossword. All I could do now was the thing I'd always done when someone I loved walked off a ledge. Start writing down exactly how far the fall was going to be. Word of the ban traveled the way bad news always does in a small family, fast and dressed up as concern. An aunt texted to say she was so sorry about all this, and then asked, in the same breath, whether I'd heard how much the gala was costing. A cousin sent a crying face and nothing else. And then Vanessa called, her voice syrupy with the particular kindness she saved for kicking someone. She said she just wanted to make sure I understood, that Mom was under so much pressure, that maybe it was for the best if I sat this one out gracefully. Then she said it, casual as weather. You know how it is. Mom just can't have the party turning into a thing about her lowly single daughter. There it was again. Lowly. She wore my mother's word like a borrowed coat. I didn't take the bait. I told her I hoped the party was beautiful, and I meant the half of it that was true, and I hung up before she could hear anything in my voice worth reporting back. Silence, I'd learned, is a currency my family never learned to spend. They mistook it for surrender every time, but I wasn't surrendering. I was doing what I do when the numbers stop making sense, which is to stop talking and start looking. That night, I opened a clean spreadsheet, the kind I'd built 1,000 times for strangers, and at the top, I typed a single name. Hale. If you've ever been the family's calculator, good enough to fix the mess, never good enough for the photo. You already know this, quiet. Stay with me. The receipts always surface. Comment boundaries if you've had to set one, and subscribe so you don't miss how this turns. Saturday, Daisy and I threw our own party. We drove out to the north end of Lakemont where the water goes flat and gold in the late afternoon, and we spread a blanket that had been my father's, and we invited exactly 2 guests, my old friend Renee and her boy. There was a lemon cake I'd made from scratch, lopsided and perfect, and Daisy gave a toast to the frog named after her teacher. Renee's husband, Paul, came along late, still in his work shirt. Paul was a loan officer at the community bank downtown, a decent man who'd given me my first business account when nobody else would, and he sat on the blanket and told easy stories while the kids threw bread at the ducks. At one point, he asked how my mother was doing, and I said fine, and he tilted his head the way careful men do when they know something they shouldn't say. He let it go. So did I. It was too good an afternoon to spend on the Hales. Daisy fell asleep in the truck on the way home with lake water in her hair and frosting on her chin, and I carried her in and thought, not for the first time, that I already had everything my mother's guest list was pretending to protect. A child who felt safe, a table where no one was lowly, work I was proud of. My mother could have her ballroom. I had the lake. What I didn't know yet, driving home under the first stars, was that the decent man on my father's blanket had just become the second person in this story who could see the shape of the thing before I could. And in a week, he'd be the one who told me it had a name. The first real crack came in through my own office phone, wrong number and right instinct all at once. A man called Hale Ledger looking for Dunn Contracting. The numbers were 1 digit apart in the directory, and he was 3 unpaid invoices past patient. He was a drywall subcontractor, tired, blunt, and he assumed I was Grant's bookkeeper. Before I could correct him, he'd told me half of it. Grant owed him $11,000 on Lakemont Ridge. The project hadn't broken ground. There was no ground. The option on the land had lapsed months ago. He'd heard Grant was raising a new round, and he wanted his money before the music stopped. I let him talk. I said I'd pass the message along, which was true in a way he didn't expect. Then I hung up and sat very still. Lakemont Ridge wasn't a slow project. It was a story, and my mother's house had just been mortgaged to fund the next chapter. I didn't call anyone. I didn't warn Vanessa. I had no standing, no proof, nothing but a stranger's grievance and a wrong number, and I knew from 20 years of ledgers that outrage without documentation is just noise you can't take to a bank. So I opened the spreadsheet again and I gave the drywall man a row. Date, amount, source. Then I started the slow, boring, unglamorous work that has undone more liars than any shouting match ever will. I pulled the county records. I looked up the land. And there, in black public ink, was the truth the whole family had been too dazzled to check. The parcel Grant swore he owned belonged to someone else entirely, and had for over a year. The number at the bottom of the column had a name now: fraud. Now that I was looking, the lie was everywhere, and it was tightening. Grant and Vanessa spent the next week reassuring the family that the investment was already returning, that the gala was proof of how well things were going. My mother poured more into it, another few thousand for flowers because a woman doesn't turn 60 twice, and because spending money is the loudest way to insist you still have it. Then came the invitation I actually got. Vanessa called to say Mom wanted me to come to a healing tea, just us women, to put the ugliness behind us before the party. I knew a healing tea when I smelled one. It wasn't an olive branch, it was a fishing line. They wanted to know what I knew, or they wanted to borrow against my good credit, and I wasn't sure which was worse. I went, because Daisy deserved a grandmother who at least tried, and because you learn more at a table than you ever do avoiding one. I sat with my hands around a cup that cost more than my monthly heating bill, and I said very little. My mother did most of the talking, and near the end, flustered by my silence, she let a number slip. "It's not as if we're hurting," she said. "The line's barely at 40 of the 80. $80,000. A HELOC of $80,000 against a paid-off house, half of it already gone into a subdivision that did not exist." I set my cup down without a sound. I thanked her for the tea. And I drove home doing the only kind of praying I know how to do, the kind that runs in columns, because I finally understood the size of the hole, and I understood that no one in that house could see the bottom of it but me. 2 days after the tea, my mother did something she hadn't done in a year. She texted to ask if she could see Daisy. Just Daisy, an hour, the park by the library. Every warning bell I owned went off, and I answered every one of them by saying yes with conditions. I would be there, on a bench, in view. Daisy could go if Daisy wanted to, and Daisy, who forgives faster than she should, wanted to. So I watched from 30 feet away while my mother pushed my daughter on a swing and, for the length of 1 hour, looked less like a matriarch and more like a woman I half remembered from before the throne. She laughed at something Daisy said. She fixed the collar of Daisy's coat with a tenderness she'd never once shown me. And when she walked Daisy back to my bench, she paused, and for a strange second she looked at my girl, small and bright and unbothered, and something moved behind her face. "She's not afraid of anything," my mother said, almost to herself. I was. At her age, I was afraid of everything. I asked her what she'd been afraid of. She opened her mouth. She closed it. "I was you once," she said, so quietly I almost missed it. And then she stood up straight and the throne came back into her spine and the moment was gone. She said she'd see me never, essentially, and walked to her car. I sat there holding Daisy's warm hand and turning that sentence over. I was you once. I didn't know yet what it meant. But I filed it, the way I file everything, and I would understand it 3 weeks later in a room full of people, at the worst and truest possible time. She called in a favor before she'd give me a kind word, of course. My mother needed the storage unit cleared, my father's unit, the one she'd been paying on for 3 years without ever opening, and she wanted the space and didn't want to feel the loss. Would I do it? Of course I would. Some part of me had been waiting for permission to stand in a room that still smelled like him. Raymond Hale had kept his life in careful boxes, and clearing them was like reading a man's mind one carton at a time. His work boots. A coffee can of framing nails. The level he'd used to build the house on Ridgeline, its little bubble still dead center after all these years. I worked for hours, sorting keep from donate, and I let myself cry the plain, useful way you cry over a father who was decent and gone. Near the back, under a tarp, I found his old tackle box, and beneath that, a small steel lockbox I'd never seen, gray, dented, with a strip of masking tape across the top. On the tape, in his blocky carpenter's hand, was my name, and nothing else. Erica. Not the family. Not Mom. Me. I sat down on an overturned crate with the box in my lap, and my heart going hard, because my father had hidden something in the one place my mother would never look, and labeled it for the one child she'd written off. I shook it, gently. Something shifted inside. Papers and a smaller, heavier thing. It was locked. And in the whole tackle box, in the whole unit, I could not find the key. I drove home with the box belted into the passenger seat like a person, and I did not sleep, because I knew my father, and my father never hid a thing that didn't matter. It took me 2 days to find the key, and I found it where he'd have known I'd look. Taped inside the lid of the tackle box, under the tray, in a spot only a person who'd fished beside him would think to feel. Raymond always said the important thing rides under the obvious thing. I held the little key and didn't open the box. Not yet. I was afraid of it the way you're afraid of a door you can't unopen. And while I sat there talking myself into it, my phone buzzed with a text from Paul, Renee's husband, the loan officer, and the timing of it raised the hair on my arms. Erica, it read, not my business, and I'll deny I said it. But there's been unusual activity on your mother's property. Liens getting filed. If she's got an advisor, tell her to call a real lawyer this week, not next week. I read it 3 times. The 2 halves of my life, the family and the ledgers, the box on my table and the house on Ridgeline, had just reached for each other across the dark. Whatever my father had locked away, and whatever Grant had set loose, they were about to arrive at the same time. I texted Paul a single line of thanks and told no one else. Then I put the key in the lock. My hands, which do not shake over $1,000,000 audits, shook over a dented gray box in my own kitchen. Because I already knew, the way you know weather, that my father had seen this coming from inside his own grave, and that he had left me not a keepsake, but an instruction. I turned the key. The lock gave with a small final click, and I opened it. Inside the box were 2 things. A letter, folded once, my name across the front in his hand, and under it, a slim packet of legal papers held with a binder clip gone orange with rust. I read the letter first because he'd have wanted me to hear his voice before I read the law. Erica, it began, you were always the one who counted the cost when no one else would. Your brother spends, your sister pretends, your mother, God love her, believes that if a thing looks solid, it is solid, and one day that belief is going to cost her this house. When it does, don't argue with her. You can't win an argument with a woman defending her own pride. Just keep the book straight, and keep our girl safe, and let the truth do the arguing for you. I put the house where pride can't sell it. You'll know what to do because you always have. Love, Dad. I could barely see the papers through what was in my eyes, but I made myself read them, and when I did, the room went very quiet and very clear. My father had placed the house on Ridgeline into a trust, not left to my mother outright, as everyone assumed. Held in trust, with a clause he'd had a lawyer draw up the last year of his life, protecting it from being sold or seized to cover any single family member's debts, and naming a trustee to guard it for the next generation. For Daisy, my mother could live there as long as she drew breath. He'd written it plain, but the house itself was locked inside an irrevocable trust, and not one board of it could be sold or borrowed against without the written consent of the trustee he'd named. He'd set it up quiet in his last year, and told no one, leaving my copy in the box and only the bare deed on record. And the trustee, in his careful block letters, was me, not my mother. Which meant the $80,000 line someone had strapped to this house had been strapped there without a shred of real authority, because the one person on earth who could ever have pledged it had never signed a page. He'd known. Sitting in that hospital bed doing the arithmetic of his own family, my father had known that someday pride would try to sell this house, and that I'd be the only one still reading the fine print. I held the letter to my chest and I heard Daisy's voice in my head, clear as the day she said it in the bath. Are we not real family? Yes, baby. We were the realest thing he had too, and he'd made sure of us before he went. I want to be honest about the next morning, because this is where a different woman might have driven to Ridgeline Road and set the letter down on the kitchen table, and finally won the argument. I didn't. My father had told me not to, and more than that, I knew it wouldn't work. You cannot hand a proud woman a piece of paper and expect gratitude. She'll only hear that you've been sharpening a knife. So I chose the other weapon, the slow one, the one they never see, because they don't believe I own it. I chose documents. I chose the truth. Built brick by boring brick until it could stand up in a room by itself, and needed no help from my temper. She chose to be a lowly single mom. Fine. I chose to keep this family's books straight while they kept up appearances, and now those two choices were going to meet. I started where I always start. I pulled the recorded deed and confirmed the trust was properly filed, valid. My father's careful hand reaching up out of the county archive to protect us. Then I mapped the HELOC, the liens Paul had warned me about, the timeline of the money, the shell of Lakemont Ridge. I built a folder, tabbed and dated, the kind I'd hand a judge without blushing. And near the bottom of the loan file, in the fine print of an authorization form, I found something that stopped me cold. A signature. My mother's name, on a document dated the 3rd of March, a trustee's certification the bank had demanded before it would lend against a property that public record showed was held in trust. The paper swore my mother had full authority to pledge the house. She had never held that authority in her life, and she'd never knowingly have signed a page claiming she did. I laid 3 of my mother's real signatures next to the one on the March authorization, checks, her will, the birthday card she'd signed for Daisy back when she still signed them. My mother's L is a proud, looping thing, the crossbar of her T always slashing up to the right. Impatient. The signature on Grant's form was careful where she is careless, and lazy where she is proud. It was a good forgery. It was not her hand. Then I checked the date, because dates are where liars get sloppy, and the date is what turned my stomach to stone. The 3rd of March. I knew exactly where my mother had been on the 3rd of March, because I'd driven her there myself when Vanessa couldn't get away. She'd been at the eye surgeon in Millbrook, 60 miles off, getting her cataracts done, her eyes taped and bandaged, unable to read a menu let alone sign a legal grant of authority. She had not signed that paper because she could not have. Grant had signed it for her. He'd waited until the 1 week she was blind and dependent, and he'd used her name to open a door into my father's house. And because that house sat inside my father's trust, and my mother had never once been its trustee, that single forged certification was the only thing that had let the bank fix a lien to it at all. Pull that one page and the whole $80,000 claim came unglued at the seams. This was no longer a family disagreement about a bad investment. This was forgery. It was fraud. It was, in the plain language of the statutes I'd studied, a felony. And the victim was a 60-year-old widow who'd been too vain to let her accountant daughter read the papers, and too trusting of the smiling man who'd made himself indispensable. I sat back. I did not feel triumph. I felt the cold, level calm I feel at the bottom of any book that finally balances. I knew what he'd done. I could prove it. And now I had to decide, carefully, what to do with a truth this heavy. I gave them one chance. Not for their sake, for Daisy's, so that someday I could tell her I'd offered a door before I opened a window. I met Vanessa at a diner off the highway, neutral ground, and I laid it out flat and quiet. I told her I knew about the $80,000 line against Mom's house. I told her Lakemont Ridge didn't exist. And I told her, watching her face, that the March authorization carried a signature Mom couldn't have made because Mom was in surgery that day. Come clean to her before the bank does, I said. Tell her the truth. Help me unwind this, and I'll stand beside you when it gets hard. All of it. For 1 second I saw the fear underneath the foundation, the girl who'd nearly lost her business 4 years ago and let me save it. Then the foundation slammed back down. She called me jealous. She called me a bitter woman trying to blow up the family because I hadn't been invited to a party. And then she reached for the oldest brick in the wall. At least I'm not a lowly single mom, she said, poking through other people's finances because she's got nothing of her own. I didn't flinch. I'd been called that word so many times it had stopped drawing blood. I looked at my sister, at the panic she was decorating with cruelty, and I felt something closer to pity than rage. Okay, I said. I left money on the table for both our coffees. You just chose the hard way, Vanessa. I'm going to let you. And I walked out into the parking lot, into the ordinary afternoon, carrying a folder that could end her husband, and I understood that the party 3 weeks out was no longer a party. It was a deadline. The lien came for the house 11 days before the gala. It came the way these things always come, not with a knock, but with an envelope, certified, official, a notice of default, and a warning that foreclosure proceedings could follow. Grant had stopped servicing the debt. The money was gone into the ground that wasn't there, and the bank wanted the collateral, and the collateral was my father's house. My mother called me at 7 in the morning, and I almost didn't recognize her voice. The throne was gone from it. She was crying, the ugly, uncomposed crying of a woman who has just watched the floor open under 60 years of careful appearances. They're going to take the house, she said. They sent a paper. Grant won't answer. Vanessa says it's a mistake. Erica, they're going to take your father's house. I stood in my kitchen with the phone in one hand and my father's letter still on the counter where I'd left it, and I let her cry. And I did not say I told you so, because there is no colder comfort, and my father had asked me not to. What I felt, God help me, was not victory. It was grief, the old kind, the kind that runs in the family. Everything he'd built with his hands was about to be auctioned to cover a lie a smiling man had told my proud, frightened mother. She kept saying my name into the phone, over and over, the daughter she'd banned from her birthday, now the only name she could think to call. What do I do? She whispered. Erica, tell me what to do. And after a lifetime of not being asked, I finally was. I closed my eyes. Don't sign anything else, I said. Don't talk to Grant, I'm coming. She came to my office that afternoon, which she had never once done in the 8 years I'd had it. She stood in the doorway of my one small room above the hardware store and looked at the space heater and the 3 client folders and the diploma I'd earned at a kitchen table, and I watched her see it, maybe for the first time, as something real. Then she sat down across from me and her pride broke open, and out of it came the thing I'd been waiting my whole life to understand. She told me about the years after Daisy's age, the years no one talked about, when Raymond was away and money was short, and she'd been, for a time, a single mother in a town that had no mercy for one. How her own sisters-in-law had looked at her, how they'd used that word, or its cousin, at a Christmas she never forgot. How she'd sworn, when Raymond finally came home and they finally rose, that no one would ever look at a Hale that way again. And then you, she said, not cruel now, just wrecked. You went and became the thing I clawed out of. Every time I looked at you, I saw that Christmas. I sat with that. It explained everything and excused nothing, and I let both of those be true at once. She wasn't a monster. She was a frightened woman who'd handed her pain to the wrong daughter and her money to the wrong man. But she still hadn't said she was sorry. She'd come for a rescue, not a reckoning, and I knew the difference. I can save the house, Mom, I said. I think I can, but not for your pride, for Dad, for Daisy. And there are going to be conditions. She looked up. Anything, she said. She had no idea what she was agreeing to. I laid out my terms the way I'd lay out an engagement letter, plainly, because tenderness at that moment would have been a lie, and my mother had drowned in enough lies. Condition 1, full access. Every account, every statement, every password, every paper she'd signed or thought she'd signed for the last 2 years. Condition 2, no more contact with Grant, not a call, not a text, nothing he could later twist. Condition 3, she would let me bring in the people I trusted, and she would do exactly what they and I told her, without improvising, without protecting anyone's feelings, including her own. And condition 4, the one that made her wince, the one that mattered most. When this is over, I said, however it ends, you will never again decide whether my daughter is real family. That word is retired. Are we clear? She nodded, small. That afternoon I made 2 calls. The first was to Paul, off the record, who told me how to freeze the bleeding and which department at the bank actually listens when fraud is on the table. The second was to a forensic accountant I'd trained beside years ago, a woman named Colleen who eats men like Grant for breakfast and sends back the plate. By evening, I had the beginnings of a war room on my dining table, tabs and timelines and my father's trust papers anchoring the whole thing like a keel. My mother sat in the corner watching her lowly daughter work, and for once, she said nothing. Because for once, there was nothing to say that could help, and she was finally, at 60, learning the value of being quiet in a room where someone competent is saving your life. The gala was 10 days out. I intended to save the house before it. I did not intend to save anyone's reputation. We built it in 9 days, Colleen and I, at my dining table after Daisy was asleep, the two of us tracing money the way you trace a crack back to the fault. It was all there once you knew to look. The 80,000 line against the house, the transfers into an LLC Grant controlled, dressed up as development costs for land he'd never bought, the lapsed option on the parcel, the March authorization with the forged signature, cross-checked now against the eye surgeon's records, which Colleen knew how to request, and which put my mother in a Millbrook operating chair on the exact day her name appeared on a bank form 60 miles away. Motive, means, opportunity, and a paper trail a child could follow. We took it to the bank's fraud unit, and the tone of the room changed the moment Colleen said the word forgery and slid the surgical records across the table. A default is the bank's problem to collect. A forged instrument is the bank's problem to answer for, and suddenly the people who'd wanted to take the house wanted very much to understand how a fraudulent line had been opened under their own roof. Their own counsel sat in on the second meeting, read the recorded trust, and went a shade paler. A lien fixed to trust property on a forged trustee certification wasn't merely uncollectible, it was a mess the bank now owned, and he put the request in writing himself. By the end of that week, the legal department had issued a formal hold on the foreclosure pending investigation and referred the forgery to the district attorney's office. And somewhere in that same week, Colleen found the thing that made my stomach drop for the second time, because it meant this was bigger than us. Grant had run the same play on 2 other families in the next county, same fake subdivision, same smiling reassurances, same widows and second mortgages. My mother wasn't his first mark. She was just his latest, which meant when this surfaced, it wasn't going to surface quietly as a family embarrassment. It was going to surface as a case. And Grant Dunn had just RSVP'd yes to a 60th birthday party where the guest of honor's accountant knew everything. Vanessa figured out I was close the way prey figures out the grass has gone quiet. She started calling. When I didn't answer, she called the family. Within days, I was the villain in a story I'd never told, the jealous single mother tearing the family apart out of spite, poisoning mom against her own children, obsessed, unstable, dangerous. She was good at it. She'd had practice, and half the aunts believed her because it was an easier story than the true one. Then she did the thing that ended whatever mercy I had left. She got to my brother Kyle, and through Kyle she sent word that if I didn't back off, they'd make sure Daisy lost the whole family, that a little girl didn't need to grow up knowing her mother had destroyed her grandmother's life. She used my child as leverage. She threatened an 8-year-old's belonging to save her husband's freedom. I have a long fuse, longer than anyone in that family ever credited me for. That was the match. But even then I didn't shout. I did what my father told me to do. I let the truth do the arguing. I called Vanessa back once, and I kept it short and cold. You will not use my daughter again, I said. Not as a threat, not as a bargaining chip, not ever. And if you say her name in one more of these little campaigns, I will stop protecting the part of this that protects you. Silence on the line. She hadn't understood until that second that some of what I'd been holding could bury her too, and that I'd been holding it back on purpose. Wait till the party, she finally hissed and hung up. She meant it as a threat. I took it as a location. 3 days before the gala, the bank moved. Officially, quietly, in the language of institutions that have discovered a fraud under their own signature and want it handled before it becomes a headline. The foreclosure was suspended pending investigation. The forged authorization was flagged and referred. And a lawyer from the bank's side, along with Colleen, began the careful work of separating my mother, the defrauded party, from Grant, the man who'd defrauded her, so that the house on Ridgeline could be pulled back from the edge and settled where my father had always intended it, inside the trust, safe, for Daisy. It was working. 9 days of tabs and timelines and midnight coffee, and the thing my father foresaw from a hospital bed was being undone, brick by boring brick, exactly the way I'd promised. But my mother, being my mother, had one last request, and it was so purely her that I almost laughed. She asked me to keep it quiet until after her birthday. The party was already paid for. The guests were already coming. And she could not bear, she said, for 60 people to watch her be a fool at her own gala. "Let me have the one night," she said, "then do whatever you have to." I thought about it for a long time. I told her I wouldn't start anything at the party. I wasn't going there to perform a reckoning, and I had no speech planned. But I also told her the truth, because I was done softening truths for her comfort. "I won't light the match, Mom," I said, "but if the truth walks into that room on its own, I'm not going to lie to protect the man who did this. Not even for one night." She didn't like it, but she'd run out of the standing to argue. The gala was 2 days away. The night before the party, I sat on the edge of Daisy's bed and asked her a real question. Did she want to go to Grandma's birthday, now that we were invited after all? Because we were. My mother, in the wreckage, had quietly told me to bring her, had needed us there the way the drowning need the shore. Daisy considered it with her whole serious face. "Will there be cake?" she asked. "There would." "Will Grandma be nice?" I told her the truth, that Grandma was trying, that trying was hard for her, and that either way I would be right beside her the whole time. She decided she would go because she is braver than the rest of us, and because there would be cake, and she informed me that she would wear the dress with the pockets. I laid it out. Then I laid out my own plain gray dress, the one I wear to meet with clients, because I was not going to that ballroom in disguise as someone softer than I am. I packed my bag the way I always do, and out of habit, or maybe instinct, I put the folder in it, tabbed and dated, and my father's letter, the original, folded in its old crease. I told myself I wasn't planning to use them. That was true. I wasn't planning anything. But I have carried a fire extinguisher into enough rooms to know you don't leave it in the truck just because you don't expect a fire. I turned off Daisy's light. I stood in the dark hallway of our small, real, unlowly home, and I thought about the ballroom, and the string quartet, and the 60 people, and the man who'd be raising a glass among them. I wasn't going to say a word. I didn't have to. The Lakemont Club ballroom did what money asks it to do. Chandeliers. A string quartet in the corner sawing out something tasteful. 60 of the county's most respectable people in their good clothes, holding glasses of the good wine, and my mother in the champagne dress moving among them like a queen who'd temporarily misplaced her kingdom and was betting no one could tell. I came in quietly with Daisy's hand in mine, and the room noticed, the way rooms do, a small stir passing through it, the band daughter arriving after all. I didn't perform anything. I found a table near the back, got Daisy a plate, and watched. Grant was in his element, moving table to table in a blazer that cost more than my rent, and I realized, cold, what he was actually doing. He wasn't just attending, he was working the room. I heard the words, Lakemont Ridge, float up from 3 different conversations. He was raising his next round, right here, among my mother's guests, using her 60th birthday as a pitch meeting, planning to walk out of that ballroom with checks from the same people toasting her health. The audacity of it was almost beautiful. He was going to defraud the guest list at the party the fraud had nearly paid for. And somewhere across the room, standing near the bar in a suit instead of his work shirt, was Paul, invited as a family friend, a loan officer who happened to know exactly what Grant's subdivision was worth. I felt the whole thing tilt toward a single point, the way a column tilts toward its total. I hadn't planned a reckoning. But I'd brought the extinguisher, and Grant Dunn was about to strike a match in a room I'd spent 9 days filling quietly with the truth. Grant tapped his glass with a fork, and the ballroom hushed, and he stepped up beside my mother with the microphone the club had set out for the birthday toasts. He toasted her first, smooth as ever, 60 glorious years, the heart of this family, and everyone raised their glasses. And I raised mine too, for her, because some of it was even true. Then he pivoted, the way a salesman pivots, from the woman to the pitch. He said this was a night about legacy, about building things that last, and wasn't it fitting to share some exciting news on such a night? Lakemont Ridge, he said, groundbreaking soon, a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and he'd hate for the people he loved most to miss their chance to get in early. He actually said the words, limited spots. Glasses paused halfway to lips. I watched a few of the county's careful men lean in, interested, wallets waking up. And that was when Paul, near the bar, set down his drink and said, not loudly, but into one of those pockets of silence that opens at exactly the wrong moment for a liar, a single, clear question. Grant, the parcel on Route 9, that's the Lakemont Ridge land, isn't it? Because the bank's got that title to the Delgado estate, has for over a year. The quartet had stopped between songs. The question landed in the open air and just sat there. Grant's smile held, but his eyes did the thing eyes do when the floor moves. And then, because the county loves nothing better than a rich man's arithmetic, every face in that ballroom turned, slow, toward the one person there who was known to keep books. Toward me. My mother's oldest friend, Ruth, said it out loud, almost kindly. Erica, you'd know. You did the family's finances. Is it real? I stood up. Not fast, not for drama. Just the way you stand to answer a question you've been asked honestly in a room full of people who deserve the truth. Daisy's hand slipped out of mine, and I felt 60 faces settle on me. The lowly single mom, the one who wasn't supposed to be here, holding the floor at her mother's gala. I kept my voice level, the flat, unhurried voice I use to walk a nervous client through a hard return, because I have learned that calm carries farther than fury in a quiet room. You're asking me a professional question, I said, so I'll answer it professionally. No. Lakemont Ridge is not real. The option on the Route 9 parcel lapsed 14 months ago. It's titled to the Delgado estate, exactly as Paul said. There is no ground to break. A murmur moved through the room. I let it. I know this, I went on, because when a man starts handling my mother's money, I read the papers, even when I'm told it's not my area. I did not raise my voice. I laid the numbers down one at a time, like place settings. An $80,000 line of credit opened against my father's house. The money moved into an LLC that Grant controls, a subdivision with no land. And then I said the last one plainly, watching him, not her. And a bank authorization, dated the 3rd of March, carrying my mother's signature. Except my mother was in an operating room in Millbrook that day, having her eyes done. I drove her there myself. She could not have signed it. Someone signed it for her. You could hear the quartet's music stands ticking as they cooled. Then I turned, finally, to my mother, whose champagne dress had gone the color of the wine she was no longer drinking, and I said the thing I'd carried since the group chat. You told the whole family I chose to be lowly, Mom. I didn't. I chose to keep this house standing while everyone else chose to keep up appearances. That was the only difference between us. Vanessa broke first, the way the one with the most to lose always does. She came up out of her chair shouting that I was a liar, a jealous, bitter liar who'd faked papers to destroy her family because I couldn't stand that she was happy. And the more she screamed, the more the room understood, because nobody screams like that over a lie they could simply disprove. She reached for the old brick, lowly, single, nothing of your own, and it just fell flat on the parquet between us, out of ammunition at last. Grant went the other way, the way of a man who's watched a deal collapse and is already calculating the exits. He set the microphone down too carefully. He said something about a misunderstanding, about documentation he could produce. And he began edging toward the doors, and it was Paul, quietly, and one of the other men whose county Grant had also worked, who happened to be standing near enough to those doors to make leaving look like exactly what it was. The club manager had already slipped into the hallway with a phone pressed to his ear. Grant didn't run. Men like him never do, because running is a confession. So he stood in the middle of that ruined party, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, while Paul and the man from the next county, the one whose family Grant had bled the very same way, kept an easy shoulder between him and the exit and let him know, without ever raising a voice, that the district attorney would be in touch within the week. He would be, but that was for later, and later could wait. I said none of it. That was the whole point. The thing my father knew and Vanessa never will. I stood perfectly still in my plain gray dress and let them do it to themselves. The villain explodes. The truth just stands there. 60 people watched my sister come apart and my brother-in-law shrink, and not one of them was watching me, because I'd given them nothing to watch. Only numbers. Only the calm. And the calm is what they'd remember. Daisy had come to stand against my side, small and unafraid, taking it all in the way she takes in everything, and I put my hand on her shoulder, and I waited. Because there was one person in that room who hadn't spoken yet. One person the whole night had been building toward. My mother. And she was staring at me like she'd never seen me before in her life. My mother stepped toward me through the wreckage of her own party. Her mouth opened, and nothing came out. I watched her try. I watched the woman who had a cutting word for every occasion, who had reduced me to a category in a group chat, who had spent 60 years making sure she was never the one caught short, stand in front of me and reach for something to say and find the drawer empty. Maybe it was going to be a defense. Maybe, for once, an apology. Maybe just my name. Whatever it was, it wouldn't come, because there was nothing left to stand on. Every appearance she'd defended for 6 decades had just been carried out the door with her son-in-law, and the only thing still standing in that ballroom was the house on Ridgeline and the daughter who'd saved it, the lowly one, the real one, the one she'd banned. So I said it for both of us, quiet, so only the near tables heard, though the near tables were enough. I counted every cost in this family, Mom, even the ones you pretended weren't there. Her eyes filled. She didn't argue. She couldn't. For the first time in my life, my mother had no words for me, and I understood, standing there, that this was the closest thing to justice I was ever going to get, and that it was enough. Then Daisy, who had been holding my hand through all of it, looked up at the ring of stunned, expensive faces, at her grandmother, at her weeping aunt, at the whole guest list of people who'd once decided who counted as real, and she said, in the clear, certain voice of a child who has already worked out the only math that matters, "We are real family. We're the ones who stayed." The quartet did not play. No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. I picked up my daughter, who was getting too big to pick up, and I held her on my hip in the middle of my mother's ruined 60th birthday, and for the first time in years I felt entirely, unmistakably, like I was exactly where I belonged. The rest happened in the language of consequences, which is the only language that ever really counts. The bank's investigation went where it was always going to go. Grant's forged authorization, cross-checked against a surgical record he never imagined existed, took him out of the reach of any smile. He's answering for it now, and for the 2 other families in the next county, in a courtroom instead of a ballroom. Vanessa's perfect picture is gone, and with it, the marriage she'd been holding together with lies and my mother's money. The house on Ridgeline came back from the edge and settled where my father put it, inside the trust, safe, held for Daisy, the way he'd known it would need to be held. I didn't take a victory lap. I drove my daughter home that night, lake quiet, and tucked her in, and sat for a while in the dark of our small kitchen with my father's letter on the table. My mother kept the house. She lost the throne, and I think, in the strange arithmetic of pride, she may finally be freer for it. We talk sometimes now, carefully, on terms. She has not called anyone lowly since. She would not dare. And when she looks at Daisy now, there's something chastened in it, something almost like the respect she never once spent on me. I'll take it. Not because I forgot, because I'd rather my daughter grow up watching me hold a boundary than watching me hold a grudge. Here's the only wisdom I've got, and it fits in a single breath. Respect isn't something you argue for at a dinner table, it's something you keep, quietly, in the ledger of how you let people treat your child. I stopped waiting to be chosen a long time ago. What I never stopped doing was keeping the books straight and keeping my girl safe, And in the end, those two quiet habits outlasted every loud opinion my family ever had about who I was. They called me the lowly single mom. It turned out lowly was just their word for a woman they couldn't control, and single was just their word for a woman who'd already picked her real family, and picked right. That's how the lowly single mom kept the house standing. Remember it. The banned invitation, the forged signature, the mother who finally had no words. If someone ever measures your worth by your status, set the boundary, keep your receipts, and protect your kids first. Share this with the woman who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments where you drew your line, and subscribe